I should have walked away when the mother told me not to answer the hallway phone after midnight because they didn't have a hallway phone. And she said it with a nervous smile like she was joking, except her eyes stayed serious long enough to make me hesitate before nodding. And I remember thinking it was just one of those rich family quirks people laugh about later. So I agreed and watched their car pull away down the long, curved driveway while the house settled into silence around me. The kind of silence that feels heavy instead of calm. Like the air itself is listening, and the baby monitor on the kitchen counter flickered softly with a green glow that seemed brighter than necessary, pulsing every few seconds like a heartbeat. The house was bigger than any place I'd babysat before. Long, narrow hallways with framed photos that felt too carefully staged, and a staircase that creaked in the middle step, no matter how lightly I tried to walk, which I discovered while checking on little Mia, who slept curled under a blanket shaped like a cloud, breathing slow and steady while the monitor translated her sleep into faint static and soft white noise. I told myself everything felt strange because it was unfamiliar, not because anything was wrong, and I made tea I didn't want just to give my hand something to do, scrolling through my phone while the clock crept toward midnight, noticing how quiet the neighborhood was. No cars passing, no distant voices, just the refrigerator humming and the occasional soft tick from somewhere in the walls. When midnight came, nothing happened, which made me feel ridiculous for remembering the mother's comment about the hallway phone. And I almost laughed at myself until the monitor crackled louder than before. A burst of static sharp enough to make me jump, followed by what sounded like breathing that wasn't Mia's because it was too slow, too deliberate, like someone leaning close to the microphone. And I turned up the volume just enough to hear it clearly before it stopped completely. I went upstairs right away, telling myself it was interference, maybe a neighbor's device crossing signals, and Mia was still asleep exactly as before, her blanket rising and falling with each breath, so I adjusted the monitor and went back down. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard it for real this time. A faint ringing from somewhere down the hallway, soft and distant like an old telephone, which didn't make sense because I hadn't seen one there earlier, and I stood frozen long enough for it to stop on its own, leaving the silence heavier than before. I didn't investigate right away, which still bothers me when I think about it now, because curiosity usually wins with me. But something about that sound felt private, like I wasn't meant to hear it, and instead I returned to the kitchen, trying to focus on the TV without really watching it, until another sound came through the monitor, a whisper too quiet to make out words, followed by a soft laugh that felt wrong because it didn't belong to a child or to any adult voice I recognized. I muted the TV, listened again, and heard only static, but it was enough to make me stand and walk toward the hallway, each step slow, my ears straining for the ringing to come back. And when it did, it seemed to come from deeper inside the house, beyond a corner I hadn't explored yet. And as I turned it, I saw an old-fashioned phone mounted on the wall that I was sure hadn't been there earlier. Beige plastic, slightly yellowed, the cord hanging loosely while the receiver vibrated against the base with each ring. I stared at it longer than I want to admit, remembering the mother's words about not answering it after midnight, and I almost laughed again because it felt like a prank or a test. But the sound kept echoing through the hallway, louder now, and I imagined Mia waking up, crying because I ignored it, so I reached out slowly and picked up the receiver. The line was silent for several seconds, just faint static, until a voice said my name in a way that sounded like someone remembering it rather than calling me, stretching each syllable too carefully, and I froze, asking who it was. But the voice didn't answer directly, instead asking if Mia was asleep, if the doors were locked, if I had checked the back stairs, questions that felt too familiar, like someone who knew the house better than I did. And I hung up without responding, because fear finally overcame curiosity, my hands shaking enough that I nearly dropped the receiver. The ringing stopped after that, but the silence that followed felt worse, like something waiting for me to make the next move, and I checked the doors twice, then 3 times, noticing small things I hadn't seen before, like scratch marks near the back entrance and a framed photo turned slightly away from the wall, details that made the house feel lived in by someone else's habits. Around 1 in the morning, the monitor flickered again, showing Mia sitting up in bed, even though she had been sleeping moments earlier, her face turned toward the camera in a way that felt too intentional, and I went upstairs immediately. But when I entered her room, she was lying down again, eyes closed, breathing evenly, which made me question whether I had imagined the movement until the monitor crackled with a whisper that sounded like counting, slow and steady, like someone practicing patience. I unplugged the monitor then, deciding I didn't need it if I checked on her regularly, and for a while everything felt normal again, quiet and safe enough that I started to relax, sitting at the kitchen table with my phone until I heard footsteps above me that didn't match Mia's light movements, heavier and deliberate, crossing the hallway from one end to the other before stopping directly above where I sat. And I remember holding my breath, waiting for another sound that never came. When the parents returned later that night, they didn't ask how things went, only whether the phone rang. And when I hesitated before answering, the mother's smile faded slightly, replaced by something like resignation, and she nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already suspected, telling me they would call me again soon. But they didn't, and I told myself it was because I broke their rule. Except weeks later, they reached out again, asking if I could babysit for a different child at another house across town, which should have felt unrelated, but didn't, because the way she asked felt almost rehearsed, like she was continuing a story I didn't fully understand. The second house was smaller but older, with narrow rooms that held sound differently, making every movement feel amplified, and the father explained the rules quickly while glancing toward the stairs as if worried about being overheard, telling me their son Oliver was sensitive to routine, that he sometimes talked to himself when falling asleep, and that I should ignore it unless he called my name directly. And that part made me pause because it sounded too specific. But I agreed anyway because I needed the money, and because nothing truly bad had happened at the first house, only strange moments I couldn't explain. Oliver was awake when they left, sitting on the couch beside me watching cartoons, while occasionally looking past the TV toward the hallway behind us, smiling at something I couldn't see. And I asked who he was looking at, expecting him to mention an imaginary friend, but he just shrugged and said, "They like when you look away," which I laughed off even though it stayed with me longer than it should have. After he went to bed, I followed the routine carefully, checking doors, turning off lights, and settling into the living room with the TV volume low, noticing a baby monitor on the shelf, even though Oliver was older and didn't seem to need one. And when I asked the parents earlier, they said it helped them keep track of sounds upstairs, which made sense until it started transmitting faint noises that didn't sound like Oliver at all. Soft tapping like fingernails against wood, followed by a distant humming that rose and fell like breathing through a closed mouth. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe pipes shifting with temperature changes. But when the tapping formed a pattern, 3 taps followed by a pause, and then 2 more, repeating over and over, I couldn't ignore it anymore, and I went upstairs to check, finding Oliver asleep under a pile of blankets, his room quiet except for the faint hum of a nightlight shaped like a moon. The tapping stopped the moment I entered, leaving only silence thick enough to feel artificial, and I stood there longer than necessary before returning downstairs, the monitor suddenly quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Around midnight, Oliver called my name softly, and I went upstairs, immediately, relieved to have something normal to respond to. But when I opened his door, he was still asleep, and the sound came again from behind me in the hallway. My name spoken in the exact tone Oliver used earlier, and I turned slowly, feeling foolish for being afraid, until I saw the hallway mirror reflecting a shadow moving behind me that disappeared when I turned fully around. I stayed upstairs longer after that, sitting outside his room until I convinced myself it was just nerves. And when I returned downstairs, the monitor showed static. But within it, I thought I saw movement, like someone walking past the camera repeatedly, never fully visible, only implied through shifting shadows. The father had mentioned ignoring certain things, and I realized then that the rules weren't about keeping Oliver comfortable, but about keeping the babysitter from reacting. And that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because it suggested this had happened before. At one point, the hallway closet opened slowly by itself, the hinge squeaking in a long, drawn-out sound that made me stand instinctively, waiting for someone to step out, even though I knew no one should be there, and nothing did, leaving the door swaying gently until it stopped on its own. I closed it carefully and went back to the couch, trying to distract myself with my phone until the monitor emitted a soft giggle that definitely wasn't Oliver's, higher and older at the same time, like overlapping voices speaking together, and I unplugged it too, deciding I was done listening to things that made no sense. The rest of the night passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last, and when the parents returned, they asked the same question as the first family, whether anything unusual had happened, but their tone made it clear they already expected the answer. And when I said everything was fine, the father watched me for a moment before nodding, almost disappointed, and they paid me more than we agreed on, which felt less like generosity and more like compensation for something I hadn't fully understood. I told myself I wouldn't accept another babysitting job from that network of families again, but when the third request came months later, I agreed anyway, because the message mentioned it was a one-time job, an easy evening with a toddler who slept early, and I convinced myself the earlier experiences were coincidences amplified by imagination. The third house was isolated at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by trees that blocked most of the streetlights, and the mother seemed exhausted, repeating the rules quickly while checking her watch, telling me the child's name was Lila, that she rarely woke during the night, and that if I heard footsteps downstairs, I should assume it was the heating system because it made the floorboards shift, and that oddly specific explanation made me uneasy before the parents even left. Lila fell asleep easily, clutching a stuffed animal shaped like a fox, and I stayed in her room longer than necessary because it felt safer there than in the rest of the house. But eventually, I went downstairs, noticing how the hallway lights dimmed automatically, leaving pockets of shadow that made distances feel longer than they were. I sat in the living room facing the staircase, unable to shake the feeling that someone was standing just out of sight, behind the railing, and after an hour passed, with nothing happening, I started to relax enough to check my phone messages, which is when the footsteps began, slow and deliberate, exactly matching the rhythm of a person walking across hardwood floors, not the random creaks of a heating system, and I froze, listening carefully as they moved from one side of the house to the other before stopping at the base of the stairs. I didn't see anyone, but the air changed, like pressure building before a storm, and I waited for something to appear that never did until the baby monitor crackled on its own even though I hadn't turned it on, showing Lila's room from an angle that felt slightly different from before, as if the camera had been moved while I wasn't looking. She slept peacefully, but the door behind her opened slowly, without any visible cause, revealing darkness beyond it that felt deeper than the hallway should allow, and I ran upstairs immediately, my heart racing, only to find the door closed when I arrived, Lila still asleep exactly as before. I turned to leave when I heard a whisper from behind me, my name again, spoken with familiarity that made my stomach drop because it sounded like the same voice from the first house, older now, more confident, like it had been waiting for me specifically, and I left the room quickly, sitting at the top of the stairs until morning light began to filter through the windows. The parents returned before sunrise, thanking me casually, and as they handed me my payment, the mother asked if I remembered the other families, which surprised me because I hadn't mentioned them, and when I nodded, she smiled faintly, saying they all used the same babysitting network because it was easier to find someone who understood the rules. And I realized then that I wasn't just taking random jobs, but stepping into a pattern that connected these houses in ways I didn't fully grasp. I stopped babysitting after that, but sometimes at night, I still hear a faint ringing from somewhere down my own hallway, even though I live alone now. And when I ignore it, the silence afterward feels too deliberate, like something patient waiting for me to remember the rules I was never fully told. And occasionally, my phone lights up with a message from an unknown number asking if I'm available for another evening. And even though I never reply, I keep the sound on just in case it calls again.